In 1888, a German archaeologist named Edward Glasser stumbled into the ruins of an ancient city in southern Yemen. What he found there would crack open one of the Bible's oldest mysteries. There were inscriptions, hundreds of them, names of kings, records of trades, temples to moon gods, and buried in those inscriptions were names that hadn't been spoken aloud in 3,000 years. Names that matched a list in the Bible that everyone skips over. Here's something that'll mess with you. There are 13 men in Genesis who built some of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world. They controlled gold, they controlled frankincense, they had trade routes that made Solomon's Israel look like a gas station. And the Bible mentions them exactly one time. 13 names, one verse, and then nothing. They vanish from Scripture completely. No stories, no prophecies. Just a genealogy that everybody, and I mean everybody, treats like a speed bump on the way to the story of Abraham. What if I told you that when the Queen of Sheba showed up at Solomon's palace, dripping in golden spices, she was actually visiting a distant cousin? What if the gold of Ophir, that gets name-dropped throughout the Old Testament, traces back to one of these forgotten names? What if the entire ancient economy, the frankincense that burned in the temple, the myrrh that they used to anoint kings, the incense that made Egyptian rituals possible, all of it ran through these kingdoms founded by the men in this forgotten Bible passage? Today, we're going to look into this mystery. It's a mystery that's been hiding in plain sight for 3,000 years. We're going to find 13 lost kingdoms, and we're going to figure out why God's chosen people in the Hebrew Scriptures decided not to talk about them anymore. Let me paint a picture for you. It's about 2000 BC, the flood is ancient history, and Babel has come and gone. The human race is spreading out across the earth like roots in a tree, and then we get to Genesis chapter 10. The scholars, they call it the Table of Nations, but I think that kind of undersells it. This is the only chapter in the Bible that tries to explain where everyone came from. Not just Israel, everyone. Every tribe and every kingdom, every people group on the earth, every single family. It traces all the way back to Noah's 3 sons. Ham's descendants head to Africa and Canaan. Japheth's line spreads north and west into what becomes Europe and Asia Minor. But Shem is the line we're told that we're supposed to be caring about the most. Because Shem leads to Abraham. Shem leads to Israel. Shem leads to Jesus. It's the story of the Bible. This is what's called the Semitic line. Literally, it's the word Semitic comes from the name Shem. And this is the main plot line of the entire Bible. But right in the middle of that line, there's a fork in the road that nobody talks about. His name is Eber. And if you're thinking that sounds a little bit like Hebrew, bingo, you're right on the spot. Most scholars think that this is exactly the word where the word Hebrew comes from. It comes from Eber. But here's the thing. Eber has 2 sons, 2 branches of his family. One of them is Peleg, and that leads to Abraham. That's the line that we know about, and that's the line that matters to the biblical story. But there's another son. His name is Joktan, and Joktan has 13 sons. Let's read from Genesis chapter 10, verses 26 through 29. And Joktan begat Almodad, and Sheleph, and Hazarmavrath, and Jerah, and Hadoram, and Uzal, and Diklah, and Obal, and Abimael, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Johab. All of these were the sons of Joktan. 13 sons. And then the text just moves on. Nothing else about them. Here's the thing. I need you to understand how weird this is. The Bible is normally pretty chatty about important people. We get their whole life story. Abraham gets 12 chapters. Jacob gets 13. Joseph gets 14. But these 13 guys, 1 verse. That's it. They show up, they get name dropped, and then they disappear from Scripture forever, never mentioned again. Now, verse 30 tries to give us a clue. It says their dwelling place was from Mesha, as thou goest unto Sephar, a mount of the east. Okay, except we don't know where Mesha is. We don't know where Sephar is. And what does it mean to be the mount of the east? This is all very confusing things for people who don't know this biblical geography. The text kind of assumes that we know, but we don't. We've forgotten, I guess, over time. These locations are lost to history. So for thousands of years, this passage was basically biblical white noise. It had no meaning. The names were probably places, probably in Arabia somewhere, but that was about it. The trail went cold in Genesis 10 until archaeologists started digging in Yemen, which is southern Arabia, until linguists started decoding some ancient South Arabian scripts, and then until historians started connecting the dots that had been sitting there for 3 millennia. What they found in southern Arabia changed everything, because it turns out these 13 forgotten sons weren't actually forgotten by everyone. They were just not mentioned in the Bible anymore. The ancient world remembered them just fine. They remembered them as kings, as traders, as the wealthiest, most powerful kingdoms in the Arabian Peninsula. The people who controlled this frankincense, the people who controlled a lot of the gold, they were what you might say is the Rockefellers of the ancient Near East. Fabulously wealthy. And for some reason, after Genesis 10, the Bible acts like they don't exist. They're never mentioned again. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look through these 13 names, and one by one, we're going to figure out who they were, where they went, and what happened to them. And then we're going to solve this real mystery. Why does the Bible just simply stop talking about them? Why does God's chosen family in Abraham's line treat the other branch of the family like they didn't exist? Because there is a theory, and if it's right, it changes how we read the entire book of Genesis. But let's start by finding some lost kingdoms. We've got 13 names and basically zero context. But here's the thing. Ancient genealogies, they're not really all about people. They're really more about places. In the ancient world, genealogies were like GPS coordinates. When Genesis says Canaan fathered Sidon, it's not just about biology, it's not just about a son. It's saying that Canaanite peoples founded the city of Sidon. Person equals place, name equals nation. That's kind of how it works in Genesis. So when you look at the big biblical commentaries, like Gordon Wenham's work or Victor Hamilton's work on Genesis commentary, John Walton's Ancient Near East studies, they're all asking the same question. Do these names show up anywhere else? Can we trace them to actual locations? And here's where it gets a little bit wild. Some of these names are complete dead ends. Others lead straight to lost kingdoms that we absolutely know about. Almodad, that's the first one listed. The name might not mean much. It may mean not measured. It may mean God as a friend. Beyond that, we don't really know anything at all. There's no ancient inscriptions. There's no archaeological sites, no references to other texts. Wenham literally calls this one of the most obscure names in all of Scripture. So Almodad is a ghost. He's a dead end. Then there's Shelef. It could mean drawn out. Some scholars guess it's somewhere in Yemen, which is in southern Arabia, based on linguistic patterns, but there's really no smoking gun here either. No other information that we can gather. So that means that's another dead end. Now, that brings us to Hazarmaveth. This is where the trail gets a little bit warmer. The name literally means court of death or village of death, which, okay, that's pretty serious. But here's the kicker. There's a region in southern Yemen called Hadramaut. Now, that's the same continent, same location, and Hadramaut wasn't just any region. Hadramaut was a kingdom, a major kingdom. John Walton confirms this in connection in his IVP Bible background commentary. He says that archaeological digs have found massive temple complexes, irrigation systems, inscriptions dating back to at least 1000 BC, all in this same region of Hadramaut. Okay, so that means we found one. Hazarmaveth equals Hadramaut. That's not just speculation, that's a match. We're 1 down, 12 to go, and we're making good progress here. That brings us to Jerah, which means moon, possibly a moon-worshipping tribe, but there's not really any solid location. And the other one is Hadoram, which the name means Hadad, the storm god. Maybe there's something in central Arabia, but it's still pretty fuzzy, so that's another couple of strikeouts. But then we come to Uzal. Ancient Yemen had a city called Uzal. That city is now called Sanas, the capital of modern Yemen. Islamic tradition literally says that Sanas used to be called Uzal, named after one of Joktan's sons. The next one is Dikla, and that maybe means palm grove, but it might be an oasis. It's pretty unclear. Then there's Obal or Ebal, depending on which manuscript you're reading, and it probably is a scribal mix-up over the centuries. And then there's Abimael, which means God is father, but it tells us nothing about where. So those are three dead ends because there's really not any archaeological evidence for them. And that kind of brings us to the name that you might definitely recognize, Sheba, as in the Queen of Sheba, as in one of the most legendary kingdoms in the ancient world, Sheba. Here's where it gets pretty complicated. There are actually two Shebas in Genesis 10. One's descended from Ham through Cush. The other one is this one, Shem through Joktan. Kenneth Kitchen, one of the leading Old Testament historians, thinks this might be a different tribal group than eventually emerged. But here's what we know for sure. Sheba was real. I mean, massively real. Southern Arabia, modern Yemen, and parts of Ethiopia, they all controlled trade in gold, spices, and precious stones. When the Queen of Sheba rolls up to Solomon's palace in 1 Kings chapter 10, she's not just some exotic visitor. She's like a CEO of a commercial empire. She traces back to Joktan. This is, for us, in our study here, the third confirmed match. Then there's Ophir, the legendary source of Solomon's gold. 1 Kings 9:28 says, "And they came to Ophir and fetched from thence gold 420 talents and brought it to King Solomon." For centuries, people have been trying to find Ophir. India, East Africa, somewhere in Arabia, treasure hunters, archaeologists, adventure novelists, everyone wants to know where the gold came from. Here's the thing though, we have proof that it was real. In the 1940s, archaeologists found a pottery shard at Tel Kassil in Israel. Written on it says, "Gold of Ophir." Not mythology, not legend, physical evidence of trade with Ophir. And Ophir, one of Joktan's 13 forgotten sons. That's the fourth match. That brings us to Havilah, another duplicate of Sheba, mentioned in Genesis 2 as a land with gold and precious stones, probably Western Arabia. And then there's Jobab. Some ancient rabbis thought this might even be Job from the book of Job, though most scholars say that's probably not a very good match. Okay, that's the end of the 13 names. Let's take stock for a second. We've got these names from Genesis chapter 10 and at least 4 solid matches to real kingdoms that we know about: Hadramaut, Uzal, Sheba, and Ophir. Several more might be matches, in all of them in southern Arabia, all of them wealthy, all of them significant, which means Joktan's 13 sons weren't nobodies. They didn't just disappear into history. They were the founders of trade empires. They built kingdoms that lasted for over 1,000 years. They controlled resources that made them some of the richest people in the ancient world. So why does the Bible never mention them again? We are going to treat that like it's not a rhetorical question. That's really the mystery we want to solve. Because it's not like they disappeared in reality. They didn't die out. Their kingdoms kept going for centuries after Israel was founded. They were contemporary with Israel. They traded with Israel. The Queen of Sheba literally visited Solomon's capital. And yet, after Genesis 10, there's silence. The Bible never says anything about the Shebites or the people of Ophir. They get mentioned by name as places, but never connected back to Joktan. Never acknowledged as family. It's like the Bible deliberately cut them out of the story. But why? What did these 13 sons do or not do that made them persona non grata in the stories of Scripture? Well, to answer that, we need to leave the Bible for a minute, and we need to look at what the rest of the ancient world was saying about these kingdoms. Because the ancient Yemenites, the Assyrians, the Greeks, and Romans, they kept receipts. And when you read those receipts, things start to make sense. December 1869, the British Museum receives a shipment of artifacts from Yemen. Among them are dozens of stone inscriptions covered in a script nobody in Europe had seen before. Strange letters, unfamiliar language, but some of the names looked eerily familiar. For the next 50 years, archaeologists and linguists raced. They did their best to decode the South Arabian script. And what they found was a lost world that no one knew about before. There were thousands of inscriptions, temple dedications, trade records, royal decrees, building projects, treaties, all written in a Semitic language that was a cousin to Hebrew, but had been dead for over 1,000 years. And in those inscriptions, they found kingdoms, real kingdoms with real names. And some of those were the names sitting right there in Genesis 10. There was Hadramaut, exactly matching the name from Genesis 10, Hazarmaveth. There's Sheba, as in the Saba of the inscriptions, matching perfectly. These weren't just folk tales. These weren't just myths. They were documented, dated, verified civilizations. Edward Glasser, it's that German I mentioned at the beginning of the video, he was one of the first to make the connection. And in the 1880s, he documented hundreds of inscriptions from ruins all over southern Yemen. And then he realized the Bible had been giving us a map all along. But here's what really matters. It's not just that these kingdoms existed, it's what they controlled. Frankincense, myrrh, the aromatic resins that made the ancient world go round. This stuff, it was liquid gold in the ancient world. And I mean that literally. It was worth more per ounce than gold. Every temple from Egypt to Babylon to Jerusalem needed it. They burned it daily, sometimes multiple times a day. The Egyptian temples went through tons of it. Mesopotamian ziggurats had dedicated incense chambers, and in Jerusalem, God himself mandated it as part of temple worship. In Exodus 30, there's a specific recipe with frankincense required and no substitutions allowed. Where did it all come from? Southern Arabia, Joktan's territory. The incense trade route ran from Yemen up through the Arabian Peninsula into Syria. Then it branched to every major civilization from there. It was one of the most important trade routes in human history, which means the 13 sons of Joktan didn't just build kingdoms, they built a monopoly. They controlled the supply chain for religious ritual across 3 continents. And it wasn't just the Yemenites who kept records. Strabo, writing around 7 BC, describes the region in his geography. He talks about the incredible wealth, the temples dripping with gold, the trade caravans loaded with aromatics. Pliny the Elder in 77 AD calls it Arabia Felix, or in other words, fortunate Arabia, because of how stupidly prosperous it was. Even Herodotus in the 5th century BC is writing about this legendary spices and kingdoms that control them. The point is, these weren't just hidden kingdoms. They weren't obscure tribes wandering the desert. They had diplomatic relations with Assyria. They traded with Israel. They were on the map, literally and politically. So why does the Bible act like they don't exist after Genesis 10? I mean, if you think about it, the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon. Ophir shows up whenever there's gold to talk about, and the kingdoms are right there in the text. They're just never connected back to Joktan, never acknowledged as Semitic cousins, never included in the family narrative. And here's what's even weirder. Jewish tradition barely remembers them either. The Talmud, which is written later than the Hebrew scriptures, mentions Joktan in passing, like in one paragraph. There's a few midrashic texts that speculate, but compared to the pages and pages devoted to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even Ishmael, Joktan gets crickets. There's nothing about him. The only conclusion you can draw is that it's deliberate. You don't accidentally forget about kingdoms that wealthy and that close in your family. So why the cold shoulder? And I think there's probably 3 possibilities. The first theory, and probably the simplest one, is that Joktan's line settled far away. In southern Arabia, way down the peninsula, that's pretty far in ancient Israel. If you're writing a story about Israel focused on the promised land, maybe distant Arabian kingdoms just aren't really relevant to your plot. They're off screen, out of sight, out of mind. That's probably the simplest explanation. The second theory is the timeline. By the time most of the Bible is being compiled, we're talking about 1000 to 500 BC or so. Maybe those original tribal identities had already blurred. Maybe Sheba and Hadramaut didn't think of themselves as sons of Joktan anymore. I mean, 2,000 years is a long time. Identities shift, nations merge, the genealogical memory fades away. I mean, that's reasonable option number 2. All right, and then finally the third theory, and this is the one that makes probably the most sense in the context of the Bible, is that they weren't a part of the covenant line. Genesis isn't trying to tell us the story of all humanity. It's telling us the story of how God chose one family, Abraham's family, to bring blessing to the world. And Joktan's line? I mean, they're blessed too. Look at their success, obviously, but they're not a part of the specific covenant program. The Bible follows Peleg, not Joktan. One brother leads to Abraham, to Moses, to David, to Jesus. The other brother leads to kingdoms the Bible doesn't even really care about. Even in their wealth, it's still not the line of the covenant. Not because they're not important, but because they're just not part of the story that God's telling through Israel. But here is a twist. there is one tradition that didn't forget about Joktan: Islamic tradition. In Arabic, Joktan is called Khatan. Arab genealogical records going back to about the 8th century AD, Khatan is remembered as the patriarch of the southern Arabian tribes. This kind of sounds like where Joktan's people went to. Medieval Arab historians like Hisham would trace entire tribal lineages back to Khatan. They'd list his sons, and some of those names match exactly with Genesis 10. I mean, not all of them, but enough of them to show that the memory was there. Now, we have to be careful. These genealogies weren't written thousands of years after the fact. They're clearly influenced by the biblical text. But they might also preserve genuine oral traditions, stories passed down for generations about where the tribes came from. And that's kind of what's fascinating about it, because it means that in certain parts of the world, Joktan didn't disappear at all. He remained the patriarch, the founding father of an entire civilization. But it does bring us back to the question of why. What made Peleg's line special? What made Joktan's line not special? There's a little hint in Genesis 10:25. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. That phrase, that one little phrase, in his days was the earth divided. I think that's the key to the whole mystery. But to understand why, we need to zoom out even further. We need to see the ancient world the way the biblical authors saw it. We need to understand what was happening in Joktan's kingdoms while Israel was being born. Because when you see the full picture, when you see what these kingdoms were representing, what they believed, how they functioned, you start to understand why the Bible drew a line in the sand. And that line, it runs right between Peleg and Joktan. All right, picture this. It's 950 BC, Solomon is king. The temple in Jerusalem is rising, being built. There's cedar from Lebanon. There's gold from Ophir. There's skilled craftsmen from Tyre. And every single day in that temple, priests are burning incense. Tons of it, literally tons. Every morning, every evening, special festivals. There's even more on those special days. And every single grain of frankincense, it came from one place, Joktan's kingdoms. This stuff, frankincense, controlled the entire ancient world. And I know that sounds like hyperbole, but I really mean it literally. If you wanted to run a temple, anywhere in the Near East, you needed frankincense. And there was only one place that you could get it. The boswellia trees that produce frankincense grow in very specific conditions. And really that specific condition is in southern Arabia. That's it. You can't fake it and you can't grow it anywhere else. Ancient religion ran on incense. It was absolutely central to just about every culture and religious practice in the ancient Near East. In Egypt, there were massive temples burning incense to Ra, to Osiris, to Isis. In Babylon, there were ziggurats with entire chambers dedicated to incense offerings. And in Jerusalem, God himself commands frankincense to be used in Exodus chapter 30. There's a specific recipe. Frankincense was mandatory and no substitutions were allowed. Every major civilization had the same dependency on frankincense, which means every major civilization needed the same frankincense supplier. And that's where we get to make sense of the incense trade route. Nigel Groom's entire book is about this, one of the most important trade networks in human history. It starts, of course, in southern Yemen, runs up the western edge of Arabia, cuts through Petra, which is in Jordan, Damascus in Syria, and then splits toward Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. 6 months. That's how long it took a caravan to make the full journey. Camel trains loaded with frankincense, myrrh, gold, precious stones, and of course, armed guards. Caravan masters who knew every watering hole, every bandit territory, every customs station. And at every major stop along the route, a city, a kingdom, a tax station, everyone taking their little cut. But the real money, the real power, that stayed in southern Arabia. With the kingdoms that controlled the source, with Sheba, with Hadramaut, with the descendants of Joktan, that's where the real power stayed. So when I say that the 13 forgotten sons of Genesis 10 were some of the most powerful people in the ancient world, I'm not speculating, I'm not exaggerating, I'm just following the money. And here's the best part. We have the archaeology to prove it. The ruins of Marib in Yemen, the ancient capital of Sheba, these ruins, there are massive stone temples. Inscriptions boasting about trade expeditions, and the crown jewel, the Marib Dam. At the time, this thing was an engineering marvel. It was built around the 8th century BC, maybe a little earlier, but it directed an entire wadi, which is a seasonal river, into irrigational canals that supported tens of thousands of people in the Middle East and the desert. The German Archaeological Institute has studied this thing extensively. The dam was 580 meters long, used massive stone blocks, had sluice gates to control water flow, and it functioned for over 1,000 years. 1,000 years, a millennia. Rome hadn't even been founded yet when they built this thing, and it was still working when Muhammad was alive. The South Arabian script they used was closely related to Phoenician. Their language, the scholars called it part of the South Semitic family, was a linguistic cousin to Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. You can trace the family resemblance in the grammar, the vocabulary, the sentence structure, which makes this perfect sense, right? Because according to Genesis 10, they're Semites. They're descendants of Shem. Same family tree as Abraham, just a different branch. And modern genetic studies back this up. Y chromosome analysis of Arabian populations shows ancient divergence from Levantine populations. That's what we would call the Promised Land area, consistent with a split thousands of years ago. So the science matches the genealogy. But here's what's absolutely incredible. Let's look at the timeline. This Sabaean kingdom, which is what we would call Sheba, reaches its peak around 1600 BC. That's the United Monarchy under David and Solomon. That's the divided kingdom. That's the prophets warning about judgment. Israel and Sheba were contemporary with one another. They lived at the same time, in the same region, trading with each other. When Solomon is building the temple, he's using the gold of Ophir and burning frankincense from Sheba. He's doing business with his distant cousins. The descendants of Joktan are at their peak wealth and power at the same moment that Israel is becoming a nation. And that's when we see the Queen of Sheba showing up in Jerusalem. She hears about Solomon's wisdom, comes to test him with hard questions, and brings gifts of gold and spices. 1 Kings says she gave him 120 talents of gold. That's about 4 tons of gold. Can you imagine? 4 tons of gold as a gift. That's we have so much wealth, this is nothing to us kind of money. And the text says that Solomon was impressed, which, given that he was supposedly the richest king in Israel's history, tells you something about Sheba's wealth. So Israel knew about these kingdoms, they traded with them, they had diplomatic relations with them, and Solomon married foreign wives for political alliances, but why not from Sheba or Hajmon? The Bible, not once, not a single time, connects these kingdoms back to Joktan. It never says that these are the Shebaites who are descended from Shem. It never acknowledges this side of the family tree. And really, the question still remains, why? Let's look at what happens in the text. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. In his days the earth was divided. Scholars have argued for centuries about what this means. Language division at Babel, geographical separation. Some people have even said continental drift. But I think we're overcomplicating it here. Eber has 2 sons. One is named Peleg, which literally means division. The other is Joktan, and from that moment, the 2 lines diverge. Peleg's line gets 4 verses. Peleg to Ru, to Serug, to Nahor, to Terah, to Abraham. A straight line, laser focused. This is the line that matters. It's really simple. Joktan's line, he gets 13 names and a vague geographical description, and then nothing. The Bible drops it completely. I think the division is not geographical. It's theological. God is choosing one line and not the other. One family to carry the covenant and another family to not carry the covenant. And both families are blessed. Look at Joktan's descendants. They're obviously wealthy beyond measure. They build kingdoms that last for centuries. They control trade networks spanning continents. By any worldly measure, they're successful. In fact, they're probably more successful than Israel based on that worldly measure. They're stable, they're rich, they're more powerful. They don't get invaded by Assyria. They don't get caught in Egypt for 400 years. Babylon doesn't carry them into exile. They just keep doing their thing for 1,000 years. But they're not a part of the covenant. They're not chosen to bring the Messiah into the world. They're not the family through whom God will bless all nations. That's Peleg's line. That's Abraham's family. And from a biblical storytelling perspective, that's the only line that really matters. So Genesis 10 gives us the full picture. Here's everybody, here's where they came from, here's the whole human family tree. But then we get to Genesis 12 and the story narrows a little. And from that point forward, the Bible follows one family, one covenant line. Joktan's descendants are still out there, still doing their thing, still running their kingdoms, but they're off camera now. The story has moved on. Not because they're not important, but because they're just not a part of what God is specifically doing through Abraham in his earthly mission. All right, so at this point, we've gone pretty deep. I mean, very deep. And we found 13 names that most people skip over actually represent some of the most successful kingdoms in the ancient world. They're real kingdoms. They had real wealth. They held real power. Descendants of Shem, brothers in the Hebrew line, and completely absent from the biblical story after one verse. So, what does it mean? And why does any of this matter? So let's put the pieces together. 1, they were real. Sheba, Ophir, Hadramaut, Havilah, documented in archaeology, mentioned by ancient historians, verified by inscriptions. 2, they were powerful. They controlled frankincense trade, supplying gold to Solomon, building dams that lasted for 1,000 years. And 3, they were Semitic, linguistic cousins to Hebrew, genetic relatives to the Israelites. They were all part of Shem's family tree. And 4th and finally, they were forgotten. By the Bible, by Jewish tradition, and by covenant narrative, but not by the world. Here's what I think, though, is the most important question. Why should we care? I mean, this is ancient history. Kingdoms that rose and fell 3,000 years ago. Names on a genealogy that nobody even reads. Why does it matter if Joktan's line got left out of the story? Because it changes how we read the rest of the whole Bible. You see, most of us, whether we realize it or not, we read scripture like it's trying to document everything, like it's supposed to be a comprehensive history of the world. And when we do that, we start to ask the wrong questions. We ask things like, why isn't this in there? Or why didn't they mention that? Or where's the story about this person or that place or that event? We assume if it's something that's not in the Bible, either it didn't happen or it doesn't matter. But Joktan's 13 sons proves that that's not how it works. There are kingdoms with massive temples, international trade, diplomatic relations, architectural marvels, and then there's Abraham. He's wandering around Canaan with his tents and flocks, no kingdom, no army, not even a permanent home. From a worldly perspective, Joktan's line is crushing it. They're the success story. They're the ones who made it. But the Bible doesn't care about those things. The Bible follows Abraham, because the Bible isn't telling the story of who was most successful, it's telling the story of who God chose to work through. And those are two very different things. So a few big takeaways. The first one is the Bible is radically selective. It has a very specific story to tell, the story of how God chose one family to bring blessing to all the families. And if you're not a part of that story, you don't get screen time. Not because you're not important, but because you're not part of this particular mission. There are entire branches of the human family tree, real people, real nations, real history, that the Bible acknowledges and then moves past. Joktan's line, Ham's line, Japheth's line, they're all there in Genesis 10, they all matter. But Genesis 12 narrows the focus to one family. And that's not a bug, that's a feature. That's what the Bible is trying to do. The Bible's not trying to be Wikipedia, it's not trying to tell everything about everyone. It's trying to tell you how God was working to redeem humanity, and that plan runs through a specific lineage. And here's the second big takeaway. God's blessing extends beyond the covenant line. Look at Joktan's descendants. They're not chosen to carry the covenant. They don't get the promises given to Abraham. They're not in the messianic line, but they're outrageously blessed anyway. Wealth, power, success, stability. They built civilizations that lasted longer than Israel's kingdom ever did. They never experienced the exile. They never lost their homeland. By any material measure, they were blessed, which tells us something pretty important. Being chosen for a specific mission doesn't mean you're the only one that God cares about. It just means that you have a specific job to do. Abraham's family was chosen to bless all nations. That includes Joktan's line. The covenant wasn't meant to exclude everyone else. It was really meant to include everyone else through one family's obedience. We see that important truth play out. The Queen of Sheba, who's descended from Joktan, comes to Jerusalem. She's not a part of the covenant family, but she's drawn to the wisdom of God working through Solomon. She acknowledges Israel's God. She participates in the blessing, but she's not in the story before that moment. And when the story intersects with her kingdom, there she is, because God's plan is bigger than just Israel. It always has been. And here's the third big takeaway, and this one is the one that really gets me. Sometimes the most important thing about you is the thing you're not chosen for. Peleg and Joktan are brothers. Same parents, same family, same blessing after the flood, but one leads to Abraham and the other doesn't. And there's no indication in the text that Joktan did anything wrong. He wasn't punished, his line wasn't cursed. God simply chose to work through Peleg's family for the covenant plan, which means Joktan's 13 sons, all of them, they were never meant to be a part of that plan. And that's okay. Not everyone is called to the same purpose. Not everyone gets to the same role in the story. That doesn't make you less valuable. It doesn't make your life less significant. It just means that you have a different job. Joktan's descendants built kingdoms. Abraham's descendants carried the covenant. Both mattered. Both were part of God's plan for humanity. They just had different assignments. And I think that's something we really need to hear, because we live in a world that's obsessed with being chosen, obsessed with being special, being the main character. And when we're not the one getting the spotlight, not the one with the calling that everyone recognizes, we think we failed. We think God forgot about us. And maybe we're Joktan's line. Maybe we're the kingdom builders, the steady workers, the people who create good and beautiful things in the places the Bible doesn't talk about much. And maybe that's exactly what God wanted from us all along. And here's something else that I think about. The Israelites couldn't worship without frankincense. Solomon couldn't build the temple without gold. The covenant plan depended on resources that came from Joktan's line. The Bible doesn't tell their story, but their contribution made the story possible. And sometimes that's the calling, to be essential without being celebrated, to build kingdoms God blesses even though your name doesn't make it into the scriptural narrative. Genesis 10 is there to remind us that everyone matters. Every nation came from somewhere. Every people group has a place in God's plan. Not everyone gets the same screen time, and that's okay because the story isn't over. The Bible tells us how God worked through one family to bless all nations. But the blessing, that goes to everyone, including the descendants of Joktan, including the kingdoms the Bible doesn't talk about, including us. So that's the story of 13 men who vanished from Scripture, but not from history. 13 sons of Joktan who built kingdoms so wealthy, so powerful, that their names echo through 3,000 years of archaeology, inscriptions, and historical records. They controlled the frankincense, they supplied the gold, they engineered marvels in the desert. And the Bible mentions them literally only once. Not because they didn't matter, but because they weren't a part of the story the Bible was trying to tell. They were Joktan's line, not Peleg's. They were blessed, but not chosen. Successful, but not selected. And you know what? There's something beautifully human about that, because most of us aren't the chosen ones in the stories that get written down. Most of us aren't building kingdoms in places nobody talks about. Most of us are doing essential work that doesn't make it into the official narrative. We're Joktan's line, and maybe that's exactly where we're supposed to be. So maybe next time you feel forgotten, the next time you feel like your work doesn't matter because it's not getting recognized, remember, you might be building kingdoms God blesses even though your name's not in the spotlight. And that's not a consolation prize. That's a calling. That's essential without being celebrated.